Looks complicated, doesn't it? Well, actually, replacing parts in your Ariens Sno-Thro is quite easy. Today, we're going to remove a worn friction disc and replace it with a new, following along with the instructions in our service guide for our unit. Today's example is a Deluxe 28, but even if you don't have a Deluxe or Platinum model on the 921 chassis, follow along anyway because the friction disc replacement procedure is actually quite similar for any Ariens Sno-Thro in our lineup today. Before we begin, make sure you review the safety instructions in your operator's manual and that you are up to the task.
After draining the fuel from the fuel tank, rotate the unit into the service position. Make sure the unit is secure and will not tip. Remove the snap clips securing the wheels to the axles and slowly remove the wheels. Make sure the key in each axle end remains in the axle. If it falls out, reinstall it so it's not forgotten. Remove the hardware retaining the bottom cover to the frame and keep track of the placement of each piece of hardware. Reinstallation will be easiest when the hardware is reinstalled into their original locations. With gloves and safety goggles, remove the two spring clips from the hex shaft. If the friction disc is too close to one of the clips, shift the speed selector lever on the dash panel into a different position for added working clearance. Remove the hardware retaining the bearing flange on the left side of the unit and remove the flange and the bearing from the frame. Remove the hairpin retaining the shift rod and disconnect the shift rod from the shift arm. Disengage the hex shaft from the bearing on the right side of the unit and remove the hex shaft through the left side of the unit. Remove the pinion sprocket from the chain so it is not misplaced. Then, remove the friction disc from the shift arm roller bearing and discard. Partially reinstall the geared end of the hex shaft through the left side of the frame. Then, install a new friction disc into the unit and align with the shift arm roller bearing. Align the friction disc and the hex shaft and insert the hex shaft through the friction disc. Reinstall the pinion sprocket into the chain so the spaced end of the sprocket is positioned nearest the frame. Reinstall the hex shaft through the sprocket and into the bearing on the right side of the unit. Ensure the hex shaft is engaged in the bearing and that the friction disc, hex shaft, and gears rotate freely. Ensure the left bearing is seated in the bearing flange and reinstall onto the left end of the hex shaft. Align the holes in the bearing flange with the holes in the frame and secure with the original hardware. Reinstall the adjustment pivot pin on the shift rod into the shift arm and secure with the original hairpin. Since the pin may have moved, make sure you adjust the speed selector lever at the end of the procedure. Reinstall the two spring clips into the hex shaft. You may need to move the speed selector lever to move the friction disc to allow better access to the reinstallation locations. Check to make sure the tractor components are lubricated. Gears, chains, the hex shaft, axles, and pinion shaft should all be lubricated according to the directions in the operator's manual for your unit. It may seem small, but proper lubrication is extremely critical to the performance of your unit. Reinstall the bottom cover using the original hardware. Remember, the reinstallation process is easiest when the hardware is returned to its original locations. Make sure all hardware is tight and the bottom cover is secure. Ensure the axle keys are correctly seated in the axles. Then, align the keyway in the wheel hubs with the axle keys and reinstall the wheels onto the axle ends. If the key falls out, simply return it to its original location. Push the wheels against the axle bushing and secure with the original snap clips.
And that's all there is to it. If you need a replacement friction disc for your Ariens Sno-Thro or oils and lubricants, you can find them at parts.ariens.com or at your local Ariens dealer.